Future versions of Windows 10 will reserve 7 gigabytes of space to prevent big updates from failing. Plus, game developer Jonathan Blow reveals what it would take for him to develop for Linux. A look at the 7 best Linux games available on the Snap Store. Plus, if your privacy is in the hands of others, then you don't have any. We're going to take a look at the Canonical financials. Here's what they tell us about one of the leading Linux companies. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. So the first story on the docket is that future versions of Windows 10 will now reserve 7 gigabytes of storage to prevent big updates from failing. So this article comes from Wayne Williams over at Beta News, and as always, I will link to all articles I discussed today in the show description. So Wayne writes, quote, "Previous feature updates for Windows 10 tended to fail if you didn't have enough free storage for the task. The onus was on users to free up the required space manually before the update could go ahead, but that's about to change." So if you don't have enough disk space, for one of these massive Windows 10 updates, sometimes it could fail. The update would fail. Sometimes it could actually wreck your system. So what Windows is now doing, what the future versions of Windows 10 will do, is no longer put the onus on the user to make sure he has enough disk space for future updates. Windows 10 now will reserve a certain amount of storage, 7 gigabytes is what they're saying. They're going to reserve 7 gigabytes of disk space on your system just for these updates to make sure they never fail. And that 7 gigabyte number is not 100%. It's going to be 7 gigabytes. It could be bigger than 7 gigabytes. It could be a little less. We're not sure exactly what that number is going to be just yet. But this reserve storage, it's not strictly for just updates. If it was just there, the 7 gigabyte disk space just there for those few times that you update Windows 10 a year, it's kind of wasted space. So that space is also going to be used for other things. It's going to be used for, reserving temp files, cache files, that sort of thing. Reading a little further into how it's going to create and destroy some of these temporary files. Quote, "When apps and system processes create temporary files, these files will automatically be placed into reserved storage. These temporary files won't consume free user space when they are created and will less likely to do so as temporary files increase in number, provided that the reserve isn't full. Since disk space has been set aside for this purpose, your device will function more reliably." Of course, the big reason for this space, again, is to make sure these Windows 10 updates, which can oftentimes be very big, that they don't fail. These updates don't fail. They don't wreck your machine. It was noted, I guess, by another article on this topic over at ZDNet, that this approach could prove problematic for owners of cheap flash drive PCs, because they're just not going to have enough free space on hand to just give Windows 7 gigs of space. Many of these devices just don't have that kind of extra storage, so Microsoft, they anticipate the reserve storage will be somewhere around 7 gigs, but they admit they actually that reserve storage could be larger than 7 gigs, or it could be a little less. Microsoft says that the actual amount will vary over time based on how you use your device. So I guess if from whatever it is you do on your system, if you require a lot of temporary files and cache files and things, that reserve storage space may be bigger for you than some. Again, and I think this will be something that you can adjust. Reading a little bit here in the article, Microsoft says the following 2 factors can influence how reserve storage changes size on your disk. Optional features. Many optional features are available for Windows. These may be pre-installed, acquired on demand by the system, or installed manually by you. When an optional feature is installed, Windows will increase the amount of reserve storage. So, I guess you're going to have a list of options to choose from in the settings, and the more options that you tick on that you need, the more reserve storage that Windows is going to set aside for you. So some of these are optional features. If you don't need them, I guess you can tick them off, and then that reserve storage space will be a little less for you than most others. Another reason why Windows 10 is reserving some storage space, some extra storage space, is because of language support. Quote, Windows is localized into many languages. Although most of our customers only use one language at a time, some customers switch between 2 or more languages. When additional languages are installed, Windows will increase the amount of reserved storage to ensure there is space to maintain these languages when updates are installed. So those of you that are multilingual on your computer, your reserved storage is going to be a little larger than those that only need single language support. And the second story on the docket tonight involves game development, what it would take to get more game developers to write their games for Linux. So this story comes from GameRevolution.com. This article was written by Brian Rose. Jonathan Blow reveals what it would take for him to develop for Linux. Jonathan Blow. Who is Jonathan Blow? He is best known for top indie titles Braid and The Witness. And in this very short article here, he explains what it would take for him to develop for Linux. A precursor to all this came about because there was, I guess, a discussion on Twitter by another game developer, Ben Golis. He was discussing the release of Planetary Annihilation. Planetary Annihilation was a game that they released for Windows, Mac, and Linux. Linux represented less than 0.1% of their sales. So 0.1% of sales were from Linux. But at the same time, 20% of all auto-reported crashes and support tickets came from that very tiny number of Linux users. So 0.1% of their sales was from Linux users, but 1 in 5 crash reports was from that very tiny Linux user base. So that is definitely part of the problem. So game developer Jonathan Blow, he got involved in the discussion, and he went into a little more depth on why he thinks Linux is a problem for developers as far as game development. He says the kernel itself is fantastic. The kernel's stable. He says it's the Linux user space that is the main problem. Quote, his solution would be to develop an executable that doesn't need to use the C standard library, which he says is hard, but may be needed. If you are making a new programming language, the least you can do is keep these things in mind and not build your structure on the currently existing user space shantytown. So he calls the Linux user space a shantytown. Again, he says the kernel itself is great. He has no problems, like if he was starting his own operating system, if he was creating Joe Blow OS, he would use the Linux kernel. Linux kernel's fantastic. He just doesn't like everything that's built on top of the kernel in our typical GNU/Linux operating systems. He doesn't like the user space. Jonathan Blow, he also dismissed ideas about, Linux, why it hasn't taken over the PC market. We're always talking about next year is going to be the year of the Linux desktop, and it's never happened, probably never will happen. And he says part of that is because of, the problems with the Linux user space. He says, Windows users, we'd like to say we would have taken over if it wasn't for Microsoft Windows trying to sabotage us. And, it's Windows that was holding Linux back, with their shady, evil tactics. But he says, the problems with Linux have nothing to do with Windows or Apple, Mac, He says, quote, for people who think Linux just had an especially buggy couple of years, it just needs more time, and it's now stable state and it will take over on the desktop and everyone will love it. Look at what people have been saying since 1992. For a long time, the reason Linux didn't take over was supposedly because evil Microsoft was pulling dirty tricks to prevent it. Clearly, that's not the case. I mean, even I will admit Linux has some problems on the desktop that have prevented mass adoption. But I think Jonathan here in this quote, he's taking things a little too far. Certainly the fact that Microsoft Windows is, the OEM OS of choice, that it's on all those machines. If I go to Best Buy right now and want to buy a new laptop, all of them are running Microsoft Windows, every single one, with the exception of the row of laptops that are all MacBooks. We don't have, Linux machines for sale at these stores. So I don't know if that's a Microsoft dirty trick that, they're installed on all these machines, but I think there are things that have prevented Linux adoption more than just, he's saying that Linux is, it's the user space. He's basically saying we have ourselves to blame, and I think he's partially right, but I think he's overstating that a little bit. And to be fair to Jonathan Blow, he went on to say that Microsoft's own desktop OS, Windows, is unusable, much like Linux is unusable. So he has some problems with Microsoft's own desktop, their own user space. Maybe they're a shanty town, just as much as Linux in Jonathan's opinion. But you have to develop your games on Windows, right? So you have no choice. 90% of the desktop market share is on Windows. You have to build a Linux port, right? You don't have to, or a Windows port rather. You don't have to build a Linux port. You know, we have 2% of the desktop market share maybe. So anyway, the good thing is with Steam and Proton, we can now play a lot of Windows-only games on Linux. So even if these developers decide they're only going to develop on Windows, we're going to have access to most of those games through Steam and Proton. So this is going to be less of an issue in the years to come. And the third story on the docket tonight. Let's continue with the gaming theme just a little longer. So we're going to take a look at the 7 best Linux games available on Snap Store. So this article comes from OMG Ubuntu, written by Joey Snedden, the 7 best games available on the Snap Store. So I guess this is his list of 7 best games, in his opinion maybe, that are there. I might have a different list of the 7 best games I think that are available as a Snap. As a matter of fact, I've got a couple in mind. If he doesn't list them, I'll throw them out at the end. I'm not exactly sure what 7 games are going to be on his list, but why would you install a game as a Snap, right? Why go sudo snap install name of game rather than sudo apt install name of game, or, you know, those of you that are on Arch distros, sudo pacman-s name of game. Well, sometimes you have to go get proprietary software from an outside source, because most distros do not ship non-free software by default. Most distros do not include non-free software in their standard repos. Ubuntu will not have non-free software in its repos, neither will Debian, neither will Fedora. You have to go get these things usually from third-party repos. So in something like Ubuntu, we're talking PPAs. And something like the Arch-based distros, the AUR, the Arch User Repository. Now, PPAs and the AUR are community repos. They are not curated. They potentially could have malware in them. I mean, somebody could package a PPA or AUR package and put a crypto miner in this game, for example, that you install. The good thing about the Snap Store is the Snap Store is curated. You know, these games are run through some kind of testing a little bit, so they should be a little more secure than things like PPAs and the AUR. Another reason why you might want to install some of these games as a Snap, because of the containerization factor that these games are sandboxed. Also, because these snaps are in these containers with all the dependencies you need for the game also in the container. You don't have to worry about finding dependencies for it. For example, the very first game here, Live for Speed. I can tell you right now, Live for Speed doesn't have a Linux port. So this is a serious racing simulator with a steep learning curve, writes Joey here. Anyway, many say the experience of racing in Live for Speed is the nearest thing to sitting in the actual driver's seat of an actual car in an actual race. So, really nice racing game, a fantastic game, released for Windows, doesn't have a Linux client. So, how are you able to sudo snap install, Live for Speed or whatever the name of the package is? It's because they install this inside Wine. They install this inside a Wine wrapper. Again, a Snap package is going to have all the dependencies you need. It's going to come with the Wine platform and, all the drivers and everything you need for this game. So to install it, sudo snap install, all one word, Live for Speed. Game number 2 that Joey recommends from the Snap Store, Trackmania. Trackmania Nations Forever. It's considered one of the most popular online PC racing games of all time. Again, Windows only, so this installs, the Snap pack is basically a Wine wrapper. So sudo snap install TM Nations Forever, all one word. Game number 3 that Joey recommends here in the article is fantastic. Warzone 2100. Great game. So, quote, if racing isn't for you but Galactic Conquest is, snap install open source real-time strategy game Warzone 2100. And just quickly, we'll go over the last couple of games that Joey says are the top 7, his top 7 from the Snap Store. Oh My Giraffe. I have never heard of Oh My Giraffe. What the heck is this game? Quote, for a game that's a little less demanding on the old reflexes, the cute, fast-paced, giraffe-packed challenge of Oh My Giraffe will suit. This looks like a really strange game. It is very pixelated. It looks like this game was designed with My Paint or MS Paint or something. The graphics on this look very, very retro and old school. Anyway, sudo snap install Oh My Giraffe. Super Tux Cart, everybody knows Super Tux. Now, Super Tux, you don't have to install as a snap. Super Tux Cart is probably in every single repo out there because it's free and open source software, so you can probably find this in your standard Ubuntu and Arch repos and everything. So you could install that from the repos, but if you don't mind installing a snap install Super Tux Cart. Zonotic. I have actually installed Zonotic as a snap. So Zonotic is a very fast-paced, free and open source first-person shooter. Because it's free and open source, Zonotic is probably in the repos, but I can tell you, sometimes it's not, depending on the distro. Some distros have it, some don't. So if you're one of the distros that Zonotic is not in your distro's repos, snap install Zonotic. And number 7, Minecraft, the Minecraft installer. I don't really know much about Minecraft. I've never seen the appeal of it, but for those that want the Minecraft installer, sudo snap install mc-installer. Now, some honorable mentions. Zero AD. Zero AD is a real-time strategy game that is just fantastic. Joey, he didn't include it in his top 7, but I will go ahead and tell you Zero AD is one of my personal favorite games to play on Linux. It is free and open source software. Sudo snap install Zero AD. And the 4th story on the docket tonight is, if your privacy is in the hands of others, then guess what? You don't have any privacy. So this article is kind of a lengthy article and kind of deep. So I'm just going to give a cursory overview of it. You guys, if you want to read it, I strongly suggest you read this article from Doc Searles over on Linux Journal. If your privacy is in the hands of others alone, you don't have any. Quote, if you think regulations are going to protect your privacy, you're wrong. In fact, they can make things worse, especially if they start with the assumption that your privacy is provided only by other parties, most of whom are incentivized to violate you. So think about this. Your online privacy, you're not in control at all. It is completely controlled by other parties when you are online. Because it's not controlled by you, your privacy, you have no say in, your online privacy. If you have no say in it, you have no privacy. And in this article, Doc Searles mentions Exhibit A is EU's GDPR, which was the General Data Protection Regulation. As soon as the GDPR went into effect, every online corporate entity, they put up their cookie notices. You guys, you probably had an inbox full of all these disclaimers basically saying, yeah, we're collecting, this information about you. And that was their way around the GDPR. They just had to tell you, hey, we're collecting this information about you, or you go to their website, you have to agree to their cookie notice. Basically, you have to agree to it to even use their site. If you don't agree to the cookie notice, you're not even going to be able to use their site. It's almost like you have to, it's a forced consent sort of notice, really. It's like, I guess your alternative is just not to use some of these sites, but most people, 99.9% are not going to do that. When they go to Facebook, and they get a notice, hey, about a GDPR, they're going to consent to it. What are you going to do? Quit Facebook? Most people are not going to do that. People like me would, but your average person is not going to do that. Anyway, the article goes on to say that the websites and services that had been harvesting all this data, these simple notices that they had to send out, letting they're harvesting this data, was just a way around GDPR. Basically, they're adhering to the letter of the law, but they kind of violate its spirit with these disclaimers. The article mentions basically that you are a mere, quote, data subject, according to things like the GDPR. You are, quote, the data subject. You're not an independent and fully functional participant in the technical, social, and economic ecosystem that the internet supports by design. All privacy protections around your data are the burden of other parties. So you have absolutely no control over the data that you are sharing online. It's all handled by third parties. Even these laws like the GDPR, they're written in such a way, assuming you have no control over this data. It's all about what other people do with your data rather than what you can do with your data. This article is a bit lengthy, but I'm going to scroll down here because near the end of the article, Doc Searles here, he lists all the cookies that were on his web browser at the time. Just as, have you guys ever looked in your web browser at all the cookies that you've accepted? He did so, and here's his list. Just the letter A, so the numbers and through the letter A, and look at how many cookies that start with a number or the letter A he had on his machine. Do you have any idea what any of these are? I doubt Doc Searles knows what any of these are. If these were on my machine, I would have no idea what any of these cookies are. Maybe the one here, Adobe Advertising Cloud, that looks like one of the Adobe services maybe, but most of this stuff, I have no idea what any of these cookies are. He goes through the trouble of, he says there were several hundred cookies on his machine. The list with Z was a little shorter, so Z, he had 3 cookies. One of them is zoom.us. He says, I know what Zoom is. The rest are a mystery to me. So, of all these cookies he shared in the article, he pointed out that zoom.us, he knows what that is. I use the Zoom client as well. It's a video conferencing website. But the rest of these cookies, he has no idea what they are, what they do. He has no control over them. There's no real way to manage these things. You can remove all of them. You know, every web browser has a way to delete all cookies from the system, but managing them, you know, really finding out what they're all about, you know, is a little difficult, even for technically minded people like the author here, people like myself. You know, you can't really manage these cookies. You can't even manage them on the websites that you receive the cookie from in many cases. Again, your only option really is just to remove all the cookies from your system. But then again, you don't know what most of them are. You don't know if you're removing cookies that maybe you wanted to keep. The article goes on to write near the toward the end here. So the digital world remains one where we have no common or standard way to scale our privacy and data usage tools, choices, or experiences across all sites and services. And that's what we'll need if we want real privacy online. So until we have real tools and real ways to manage our own privacy ourselves online, we're at the mercy of these third parties that really are not there to protect us. The article brings up some very deep questions, some real issues we need to consider about our privacy online. We do not have the same privacy online as we have as far as privacy in the real world, in the physical world. Until we have ways to manage our data, our personal data online, until, you know, we have control of that data, we are at the mercy of these third parties that quite frankly do not have our best interest at heart. Their interest is basically to violate us online so that they can profit from it. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight, we're going to take a look at Ubuntu's financials. This story comes from Stephen J. Von Nichols over at ZDNet. Inside Ubuntu's financials, Canonical, Ubuntu's parent company, is private, but it does share some of its financial results. Here's what they tell us about this leading Linux company. So, Canonical is a privately held company. They're not a public company, so they're not required to disclose any of their financial information, but occasionally they do give us little tidbits, little hints about their financial state. What we know is Shuttleworth has mentioned recently that, you know, Canonical may eventually become a publicly traded company. They're eventually going to have an IPO, an initial public offering. IBM, of course, recently bought Red Hat in a very big and public purchase. Canonical, you know, we've kind of speculated that eventually Canonical will probably be bought by a larger company, you know, interested in Linux. Maybe a company like Microsoft. Of course, if Canonical was ever bought by another company, or, you know, if Shuttleworth wanted to sell the company, you know, he would have to at least disclose some financial information to the company, you know, buying the Canonical. So what is Canonical worth? You know, what is the Ubuntu distribution worth, basically? So what we know is that, well, first, in March 2018, Red Hat, which is a public company, their total annual revenue was $2.9 billion. So Red Hat, $2.9 billion was total annual revenue. Its full fiscal year net income was $259 million. Now, let's contrast with what we know about Canonical. Canonical, on the other hand, they made $110 million in total revenue. So $2.9 billion Red Hat, $110 million Canonical. Their net profit, Canonical's net profit, was $6.2 million compared to $259 million net profit by Red Hat. So there is a big discrepancy as far as, Red Hat's income versus Canonical. Canonical has not been a profitable company, but just the last couple of years. Canonical was losing money for most of its existence. Ubuntu was not a money maker for them, especially since their focus with Ubuntu for most of Canonical's existence was mainly Ubuntu on the desktop. They were going to, eventually become a major player on the desktops, laptops, that sort of thing. Canonical has since kind of given up on the desktop dream. They're going back to really where they should have been all along, is the server market, the cloud market in particular. And for those wondering, the 2018 income reports from Canonical that they made, $110 million in total revenue with a net profit of $6.2 million. That was actually a pretty good year for Canonical because, again, they've been losing money. So this was actually a pretty big increase compared to 2017, where I think, they had actually made more revenue in 2017, $126 million total revenue. But the profit, they didn't make a profit. They lost $8.8 million in 2017. So what was the turnaround from losing $8.8 million in 2017 to making a profit of $6.2 million in 2018? A lot of that was giving up on the desktop and the smartphone development. They quit all that. They also downsized, less staff working for Canonical because they're not focused on these things that really never made them any money anyway, the desktop and the smartphone. They were not money makers. They were just hemorrhaging large amounts of cash, paying all these developers to work on these things that really did not bring them any income. Anyway, just a quick look at, some of Ubuntu's financials. They are one of the leading Linux companies. They're just now starting to kind of make money. Why are they not making just boatloads of money, though? Why are they not making Red Hat kind of money? It's because they don't charge the kind of prices that Red Hat charges. Matter of fact, toward the end of the article, I think Shuttleworth even had a comment that basically, Ubuntu is much cheaper than RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So that is one of so Ubuntu is free of charge, right? And you don't have to have a support contract to use it, and many people don't that use it in the server market. So that was the fifth and final story on this edition of Taking Into Account episode 24. I release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday, sometime every Thursday. So look for Taking Into Account episode 25 sometime next Thursday. As always, other than the 5 main stories I cover on Taking Into Account, I like to read viewer comment or a question to close out the show. Recently on my YouTube channel, also over on Mastodon, I had posted this image. So I posted this on the community tab of my YouTube channel, and I also posted it over on my Mastodon account. This image I thought was funny. It's basically a picture of some dentist's equipment, but it looks like a bull's head, right? It looks almost like the logo, the mascot for GNU, right? And the picture says GNU/dentist. Or, as I've recently taken to calling it, GNU plus dentist. It's an hilarious picture. And then I wrote at the bottom, I bet this dentist is a big fan of FLOSS, free, Libre, and open source software. And some people took that as, they didn't take offense to it, but they pointed out, but the free software crowd, the GNU crowd, probably wouldn't use the term FLOSS. They certainly don't like the term FOSS, free and open source software. So, I agree with them. Richard Stallman would never use the term floss, but again, it was a joke involving a dentist's office, so I threw that out there. But they are not opposed to using the term floss, the free software crowd. At least not according to their website. They are opposed to FOSS, free and open source software. They're 2 different camps, right? You have free software and open source software, but there is what I call a neutral ground for people that don't have a dog in that fight, right? They often use the term FLOSS for free/Libre and open source software. Just explicitly point out I don't have a preference between these two camps. So that's why you do see a lot of people use the term FLOSS rather than FOSS, is, to not take a side in that whole free software versus open source software debate. And Stallman and the GNU crowd, the free software crowd, actually say that that's okay. If you don't take sides in the argument and you want to use the term FLOSS, they're okay with that. So I just wanted to point that out anyway, those of you watching the video. Hilarious picture. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Dylan, Leor, Rob, and Tony. They are the producers of this show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen. You see all those names on the screen. They are the supporters of this channel. Without these folks, this show wouldn't be possible. If you would like to support my work, please consider doing so over on Patreon. You will find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.